right, thank you very much, and welcome back again from tea break. We'll go straight into our next conversation, and it gives me great pleasure to bring up the moderator for this conversation. Now, this next panel conversation will focus on industrial infrastructure, special economic zones, and master planned development as we look at new frontiers in the new normal. Please join me and make welcome the Chief Executive Officer at Dutum Group, Tope Runshewe. A warm round of applause for Tope Runshewe, please, as he comes up stage to bring other members of his conversation to the stage. A round of applause for Tope Runshewe, please. Thank you very much, Chief Executive Officer at Dutum Group. Thank you. I will now hand over to you as you bring up other members of this conversation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It will be nice to get a response. Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we're going to be going to the next panel session, and it is going to be on discussing infrastructure, industrial, special economic zones, master plan development, the rise of full-service, one-stop developments, and cities of the future. And to join me in this discussion this afternoon, I'm going to be making welcome Dinesh Rathy, the Chief Executive Officer of Lagos Free Zone. Can we make him welcome with a round of applause, please? Also joining me will be Timi Adesoya, the Country Commercial Manager for Agility Logistics Parks. Can we please make him welcome? Where's Timi? Okay, he's on his way. And thirdly, we have Rolake Akekungbe Filani, the Chief Commercial Officer of Mixta Africa. Please make them all welcome to the stage this afternoon. Good afternoon once again. This afternoon we're going to be looking at the subject of infrastructure, industrial, special economic zones, and master plan developments. And I think we have a wonderful panel who is going to be doing justice to this discussion. Just before we go ahead into some of the discussion points, I just want to highlight a few things. Talking about the continent of Africa and the population that is estimated to get to about 2.5 billion in 2050. And currently with the living conditions of majority of the continent, it is obvious that foreign direct investment is needed more than ever before. And despite all the challenges, the African real estate sector, especially in these spaces, is still a preferred destination for most global economies. So to get us started, I'm going to be directing my first question to Dinesh Rathy, that's the Chief Executive Officer of Lagos Free Zones. Now, Nigeria is a challenging but rewarding place to do business. How can special economic zones help companies in this environment to build resilience and position themselves for long-term success? Dinesh.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that question. So the special economic zone regime in Nigeria has been there in place for more than 30 years now. And there is the Nigeria Export Processing Zones Act, which governs all the special economic zones which operate in the country, which means it has stood the test of time. And also the agency which regulates this is Nigeria Export Processing Zones Authority, which sits under the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Investment. Now, having said that, what Lagos Free Zone has done under this particular regime, we have played on two factors. The first factor is developing the Lekki Deep Sea Port. The Lekki Seaport acts as the entry gate, not only for Nigeria, but also acts as a transshipment hub for the rest of West Africa. And this is the first ocean port of Nigeria, which will go live in the first quarter of next year. So that's something which we have put it all together. The second factor which we have worked upon is developing an enabling infrastructure within the free zone, which means fully built up factories, warehouses, residential apartments, commercial offices, and other support services like a fire station, police station, truck park, a medical facility to support, which means that anybody who comes in and operates straight away. And these are the things, I think special economic zones with a fully built up plug and play infrastructure is what's needed to drive economic transformation and position Nigeria in the right space. And also the operators who will be operating, it provides them a resilience because they can do it in the most cost and risk optimized manner.
Please, if we have another mic, it will be useful for the panels. I'm going to direct my next question, just piggyback off what Dinesh just said to Rolake. And I'm going to be asking about the challenges of developing urban infrastructure in the currently challenging macroeconomic environment that we currently have. What challenges do we have in developing urban infrastructure in the currently challenging macroeconomic environment?
Thank you, Temi Tokwe. Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. Well, I think I will speak from the Mixed Africa perspective. So we are developing a new town called Lagos New Town, which hosts several developments, including the iconic Lakowe Lakes, Gulf and Country Estate, as well as several other middle-income and affordable housing developments within the same land bank. I think the first challenge I would highlight is the integration into the broader infrastructure network. So when we look at developing large-scale housing, and we've been doing so not just in Nigeria, across Africa, the interlinkages between other types of infrastructure, whether physical and social, is quite important. So the road access network, and depending on what African city you're in, the rail network, the transportation network. Often what we find is that developers often have to provide the full gamut of infrastructure services or utilities by themselves and for themselves. That's one of the major challenges we found. So as a large-scale developer that is creating new towns or cities, you're running projects at very large scale that have a significant impact, both from an environment and ecological perspective, on the entire city or urban landscape. Now, Lagos is a mega city. Actually, Lagos is actually a meta city because mega cities have more than 10 million people and meta cities are huge. So because of the scarcity of land and the need to move further out from central urban areas, large-scale master planners are actually impacting the economic and social fabric of the entire city through your development. The second challenge is how you can then develop cities in a way that doesn't reinforce social or economic exclusion. And I think that's a very important point because when you look at infrastructure linkages, the way you build actually impacts and affects human behavior. And so if we're building these economic enclaves, whether it's gated residential estates or free trade zones, which are one-stop shops, you're still building and operating in an environment that has deep social exclusion, and actually housing and infrastructure sometimes does reinforce that. So the question is, how do you then ensure that those who want to get to the free trade zone or to Lagos Newtown can do so in a safe and efficient way? You need to look at the road infrastructure. You need to be having conversations with the public sector around improving either the federal or state or local road network. And I think that's one of the second challenge I would highlight. The third challenge is really, because we're talking about scale and master planning, is finding long-term, low-cost, local currency sources of capital. Because infrastructure delivery requires huge amounts of investment in CapEx. And in many cases, you're delivering services to a demographic where the middle income segment is rapidly shrinking. So how do you deliver large-scale infrastructure in a way that is affordable and efficient over a long period? And so funding, we found, is probably the biggest catalyst or driver of being able to successfully develop infrastructure in a city like Lagos. And there's a fourth point I want to touch on, which is building sustainable and climate resilient infrastructure, but I'll leave that perhaps to further down the line in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolake. So to me, what is your assessment of the performance of the Nigerian industrial real estate market? Speaking about logistics, warehousing, cold storage, and things like that. And especially link this to some of the challenges that Rolake spoke about earlier, and how it affects the industrial real estate market.
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Just for some context, I will say a little about what Agility and Agility Logistics Park do. If, for example, you were not available to hear what Ronald said, he's my colleague based in Dubai. So what we do is we basically build international standard warehouses. We acquire large expanses of land, typically 50 hectares of land, which is about 500,000 square meters. And then we build everything top structure, from the stormwater drainage to the actual warehouse itself. And we provide everything from dry storage to temperature controlled storage, to cold storage, to hazardous materials handling, to pharma, the entire works, but not heavy industrial warehousing or real estate. So to tackle your point, I think it's important to just highlight a few numbers. So in 2019, for example, the e-commerce industry brought in about $5 billion, and that was 2019. And in 2023, is expected to double. So that signifies growth, right? And in the same vein, the MBS says that as of Q4 last year, the transport and logistics industry or storage industry grew by about 30%, and is projected, and that was about 35% higher than the same point a year back. So that signifies growth. But while there's growth, there's still room for so much more to be done. I mean, we've seen what the quality and the stock of warehousing is across Nigeria, and to say the least, is not anywhere near where it should be. For example, we recently built a 20-meter high warehouse in Cairo, and if you compare that to what we typically see in Lagos, we're talking about average of 6 meters, 7 meters. And that speaks to great inefficiency in the way things are stored and the way things are handled. So for example, what we typically do in our markets across Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and the rest is that we'll build at least 9 meters and we will rack. So it's one thing to build and to have that height, it's another thing to actually rack and maximize and use that height, which is what we see that many people don't do. So that speaks to inefficiency and also speaks to where or how far the market still has to go, even though we see clearly that there's plenty of room and plenty of demand for how far the market can go.
So while you're on that subject of growth, regarding what we've seen in e-commerce, how does that then translate to your activities, and what will you say are the factors that are inhibiting your ability to deliver those warehousing facilities within the context of Nigeria, like you would in Egypt or even Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire?
And it's a very good question. Before I go into what may be hindering us, I think it's important to understand some of the plans that we, for example, have for Nigeria. And there's an in-house joke within our company where we started in Ghana in 2016, which is about 6 years ago now. And Ghana is entering its 6th phase, which totals 30,000 square meters of covered warehousing. Mozambique and Abidjan, Maputo and Abidjan total another 30K. But we're very confident that in the next 12 to 18 months, the first phase in Lagos Ibadan Expressway alone, will be in the region of 50,000 square meters, which is more or less dwarfing everything else that has been done in all our operations across Africa. So we know the macroeconomics and the fundamentals are strong enough for us to heavily invest in Nigeria. And the plan for us, and this is what we've always wanted to do, and this is what we will do across Nigeria, is to have a network of these international standard parks spread across the country. So we've acquired the first site on Lagos Ibadan Expressway, which is 27 hectares, with a further option of 23 hectares contiguously. But we're actively searching for additional sites to further expand our network. So for example, I had the pleasure of seeing the seaport yesterday. I saw the Lagos Free Zone with Dinesh. I saw all of the Free Zone yesterday. I've been to the east as well to look at other locations that are possible spots where we see our growth. And we were fully and very, very heavily demand driven. So based on that, it's clear that what the market is telling us that is there's clear reception and there's clear capacity to absorb the type of warehouses that we want to build. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we don't have hindrances or hurdles along the way. We're very confident that we will scale them, but the hurdles remain nonetheless. So I'll give you an example. We're lucky to be on Lagos Ibadan Expressway, which technically has been completed or is complete in terms of the expansion and rehabilitation. But there's a portion along Kara and towards Cummins that is still a bottleneck, which speaks to where infrastructure can be a huge hindrance for what we're trying to do. I mean, we're talking about connectivity and distribution and logistics and last mile and making sure when you get on your laptop, on your handphone or your handsets, you click and it gets delivered to you. But there's so much that goes on behind that. Not just having a DC on Lagos Ibadan Expressway, for example. Where are you going to site all your last mile locations to make sure that the person who is in inner Oba or in inner Ikeja or in inner Lekki can get what they asked for or what they requested to be delivered yesterday? So infrastructure is a huge hindrance. But I think the good thing, speaking about infrastructure, is that we've seen tremendous growth. I used to frequent the Lekki Free Zone about 4 years ago. I used to go there at least twice every week. And I haven't been there in a while. But when I went there yesterday, I was blown away as to the amount of infrastructure that has gone in there. And my understanding was that some of the roads that were built in there, I forget the amount of kilometers now, were supposed to be completed in 20 months. But they were completed in 15. And for me, and I'm sure majority of the audience agrees, that doesn't typically happen in Nigeria. They tell you it's 20 months, it will happen in 36, maybe 48 if you're lucky. So whilst there are hurdles, I think there's progress. And I think we have to continue to speak and to encourage and find ways to be creative to make sure that the infrastructure gap is tightened or shortened. And then I'll also talk about technology, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well, because technology has grown in leaps and bounds as to how people access and how people do things on the internet. And if you think about what happened in 2020 with the pandemic, things moved quickly, even despite the fact that we were all at home and we couldn't go anywhere. I mean, the logistics industry was the darling of that entire pandemic period. And I think technology was a huge beneficiary of that sector, but there's still so much that can be done.
Thank you, Timmy. Dinesh, speaking about special economic zones, special economic zones have proven game changers for the Middle East and China and some other economies. Do you think this is possible in Nigeria? And how does the Lagos Free Zone look at this opportunity?
Yeah, so special economic zones globally have played a catalytic role in the economies of China, Middle East, and as well as southern part of Asia. Now, Nigeria is sitting on a huge opportunity, and we believe that the port and the zone combination, which we have been able to establish through Lekki Port and Lagos Free Zone, sits right there at the center of that opportunity. And what we have also done, apart from creating this Lekki Port, which serves as a gateway and a transshipment hub, is also created this entire free zone, which is well equipped with world-class infrastructure like warehouses, standard factories, logistic park. So all these is there for operators to come, plug and play. We have also built in a power plant, which we can supply power at Naira 65 to 70 Naira, which is roughly about 11 cents. At 11 cents per unit of power, Nigeria can be one of the cheapest across the globe. Now that itself, coupled with Lekki Port, which solves the logistics problem, which has been a bane for Nigeria to become an export hub. So once these two you combine, I mean, we are talking about a huge economic shift in the way people look at Nigeria. And with AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Treaty coming into place, once it goes live, there is such a huge opportunity which Nigeria can latch onto. Now, thinking about this, for foreign companies or even some of the Nigerian companies, you have such a quick route to market, so much ease of doing business, you can't believe. I mean, this is unparalleled. And like what my friend Timmy was saying about the infrastructure growth, which has happened in that axis, and the kind of investment which has happened, it clearly shows there is so much opportunity we are sitting on. We have two mega projects, the largest petrochemical and the refinery. We have one of the largest fertilizer plants sitting right next to us. I mean, these are the downstream benefits which will flow into the zone. And using Lekki Port, you can create huge advantage. So, I mean, we are very, very optimistic about this whole free zone and port combination changing the fortunes of the economy.
Thank you, Dinesh. In the same vein, Rolake, what role do new towns and cities have on the urban and economic landscape of megacities like Lagos?
Thanks, Tim. But I think I sort of answered that maybe to a certain extent in my first response, although maybe that was focusing more on the challenges. I think new towns and cities are obviously a catalyst for growth, especially where they can help with local municipalities and local governments or state governments in generating additional sources of income and revenue. If you just think of the full gamut of services that are provided in new towns and cities, from waste collection to street planning to lighting, I mean, those are sources of services and job creation, which I think are extremely important. And if new towns and cities work well, what they tend to do is also act as a migratory pool from other parts of a particular country. Now, that can be a double-edged sword. And a very practical example is Lagos historically has been the commercial hub for Nigeria. In fact, the economic hub, the financial services center. And that's meant historically, Lagos has been a major pull factor for internal migration of labor. The other point I will also say is that new towns and cities can also help define and shape social mobility. So your aspiration as a small town person to live in a Lagos means that you face the prospect of improving your own socioeconomic prospects. There's social mobility, there's economic activity. So from that perspective, I think new towns and cities are very important. And then what we saw at the height of COVID is actually the response mechanism for, you know, I would say black swan events or serious public health crisis. A lot of the solutions were driven by activities that happened in places like Lagos or other cities, maybe across Nigeria. So they actually serve as an economic catalyst effect, and they can serve as a model of how to build and develop world-class infrastructure. So if you look at all the major projects that are ongoing in this city, we talked about Mixter's Lagos New Town, there's a free trade zone. I'm aware that other companies are doing new towns and cities. What many of these developers are trying to do by providing their own infrastructure solutions is actually acting as a reference point to government and state actors of what urban development and planning should be like. So I think there's also a sort of educational element, but notwithstanding, that cooperation and collaboration is extremely important. And then maybe this allows me to segue nicely into the issue of climate change. I think it was the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that said that the battle for the climate will be won and lost in cities. Cities around the world account for around 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings globally are net consumers of electricity. So actually, a large part of the solution to the issue of climate change or rising sea levels, and we know Lagos is already well below sea level, so we have a major challenge there, can actually be found within this industry and within the sector. Because let's face it, those who did it historically, who didn't do the proper drainage or where we didn't have the proper flood defense mechanisms, are also now part of the solution. So in some ways, the same sector that created the problem, and we hear the stories of demolitions needing to happen in specific areas because there's no passage for water bodies and things like that. So I really think that is an important point and role that new towns and cities can play. And then the final point I will really make, and something that we're trying to do, if you look at what we're doing at Lakaway Lakes Golf and Country Estate, it's a 308-hectare piece of property that sits on a 1,500-hectare land bank that has other developments. Within the golf estate itself, you have sort of about 12 to 14 lakes. About 60 to 70% of the entire estate is natural environment. That is a model that we found has worked because we know the positive environmental effects of tree planting. So what we are finding now in this sort of industry, in this city, that more and more master planners and developers are really looking at how they can rewrite the fabric of cities for the future in a way that is smart, that is green, and that is efficient. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolake. I have a follow-on question to that, your overall response. And it goes back again to infrastructure. And specifically looking at that corridor where the new city is and the free trade zone. And just looking at the demographics of people who are eventually going to inhabit the city, how is their access to the city? You kind of hinted it when you talked about the main infrastructure being a challenge, but what is the solution? Are they mostly going to be working and living within the city, or are they going to be transporting themselves from the city all the way there to maybe VI? And we already know what that corridor looks like presently. Yeah. So what's the solution?
I think that's a very important question. Okay, so maybe I can set it against the backdrop of how our cities have historically been developed. So one of the fallouts, legacies of colonialism, and sorry I have to bring this up, is that a lot of our cities were designed in such a way where if you look at the infrastructure system, they were built to have infrastructure starting from the hinterland and flowing to the coastal areas because, much of the colonial administration was export focused, export of natural resources. So primarily, the original blueprint of many of our cities had infrastructure that was export oriented or regionally oriented. And there's nothing wrong with that, actually. But I think what has then happened is that governments have then had to start with a clean slate and build infrastructure in a way to typically serve areas that are already heavily populated. And so if you look at what happened, so I grew up in Nigeria in the 80s and the 90s, And I remember living on the mainland there in Maryland, coming to the island was like a luxury trip. It was like going to Disneyland, frankly, because you felt like you were going outside of Lagos. And back in the day, when people were buying up land in Lekki 1 for residential use, it was like, wow, who actually lives there? But if you bought residential land in Lekki 15, 20 years ago, you're essentially laughing all the way to the bank, because that entire area, phase 1, phase 2, is now mostly commercial. And it may fall to the same fate that places like VI have been, where now a lot of commercial developments are springing up. So that tells me that if you build infrastructure in the right way, people will naturally flood or flux to that area. So for those of us who are adventurous and are going as far as Ibejuleki, the free trade zone, it's because, guess what, we see the future. We know the trends. And what we're really asking is for the public sector to support us on this journey, because this is actually a solution to their problem. So we can't always just focus on the main roads. We have to focus on the access roads. We have to think of interconnectedness. Are there ways we can extend light rail to the axis? Can we look at starting up the coastal road, which is to the south of our land bank, and I think it straddles all the way to Lekki Free Trade Zone? There's now talk of the airport. Now, if we build that airport infrastructure, how will people get from that airport to town, the center of town, or Lagos Island and further afield? So this requires really strong public and private sector collaboration. We are already being first movers. We're taking advantage of those opportunities, and developers like Agility and LFZ and Mixter are doing so. And I think in time, the other stakeholders will have to catch up. Because honestly, it is also a major economic catalyst, like I mentioned, from a revenue perspective. But I think we need to be more creative, and I'll give you other examples. So that you have countries like Indonesia, even in the advanced economies. Indonesia has a major problem as a coastal city with quite a lot of flood. But guess what? They're actually doing rainwater harvesting as a way of supporting the development of water infrastructure. We are a coastal town, and we know that one of the biggest problems in Lagos today is waste management. And in fact, waste is part of the reason that flooding is a major challenge. Can we look at cross-sectoral solutions where that waste is then channeled back as a renewable source of energy? So that way you're solving two problems at the same time. You're tackling the issue of waste, but also you're providing a sustainable and viable energy source. So this ties into the whole climate resilience part of building and developing city infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Rolake. I would ask, just as we round up the session, I'd ask Dinesh and Timmy to respond to those same questions and just give their final thoughts as we round up. So Dinesh, please go ahead first.
We always believe that the free zones and the planned cities development, they are the ones which will take the nation forward. I mean, they will ensure that the cost of doing business or even staying there is one of the cheapest and one of the best for the users. So this way, I think Nigeria really needs to look at planned city developments. Thank you.
Yes, I think in closing, everyone is in one way or the other paying the price or the high price of a dollar. And one of the ways to get out of that is, like other countries have done, you can look at Chile, for example, is to find ways to diversify away from oil and diversify properly. And one of those ways is to increase your manufacturing and to increase your exports. And that obviously trickles down into special economic zones, trickles down into manufacturing, trickles down into warehousing, trickles down into distribution. And like you touched on, the free trade zone agreement, that's critical to the way things are going to evolve across Africa and not just Nigeria. And I think Nigeria is uniquely positioned, especially with the free zone enterprises that we have, to make the best use of that to get ourselves out of where we are, being import dependent, to more export driven.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I think just in rounding up, while we're developing, a lot is happening in Lagos and the extensions of Lagos. I think it is also important for developers and business interests to start thinking of how to do similar in other regions of the country, so that, like you said, it affects mobility, so that the fabric of the country can be relatively more evenly distributed. Well, we don't have enough time to ask the audience any questions this afternoon, but at this point, I'd like to appreciate the panelists. Dinesh Ratty, I think, please let's take one. Let's take one, please. The one. Just one, please. Can we get the mic to... Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Fabian Ajogu. Perhaps to lighten the mood, I looked at the microphone infrastructure is not enough. But I wanted to ask, listening to Rolake of Mixter, we're discussing infrastructure, and the only person absent in this room is the owner of the land upon which the infrastructure is built, the public sector. Other than my good friend and our board member, Alhaji Meniri Jafaru, board of Novare, who was the chairman of the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority that granted you the license, there is no one from the public sector in this summit. So we might be discussing very important things in the absence of a critical stakeholder that may make what we discuss work or take a wrong policy that nullifies everything we're talking about. My feedback is to the organizers. Thank you.
I believe, thank you so much for that comment and feedback. I believe the organizers have taken that on board, and hopefully we'll see some change if they so desire. But thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks for your time. Thank you to the panelists. Please, a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can we please celebrate one more time this amazing panel headed by our able moderator, Tokwerun Shewe. Thank you so much. I think I learned one important thing here, that Lagos is not a mega city, it's a meta city. That's what Rolake has said. So I'll take that and note it. And she also talked about the building for interconnectedness and also building for the future.